Good evening. Shalom lechulam. Wonderful to be here. Thank you for joining us live here at the Leer Institute and also via the internet. It is a remarkable opportunity for me to be here this evening on this stage with Mr. Peter Beinart and Professor Eva Illouz, two leading public intellectuals, one in the US, one in Israel, but not only, to discuss some of the heated issues of the day. My name is Shai, Lavi, and I am the director of the Leer Institute. American and Israeli Jews in the age of Netanyahu and Trump. Netanyahu and Trump stand for a political phenomena, right-wing populism, that uses polarization as a political strategy, as a political tool. Rather than looking at social, cultural, ideological polarization as a problem that needs to be resolved, trying to calm things down, this kind of politics actively encourages polarization, undermining not only the law and constitutional bonds, but something perhaps even more precious than that, what can be called the unwritten constitution. Certain rules that govern our daily lives that we simply take for granted. Some things that we say, this is simply undone, unheard of, unprecedented, and then under this politics happens. This kind of politics may explain some of what is currently taking place in the past few months here in Israel, but also in the United States. There is much room, obviously, for anxiety. I think many Israelis feel like the country is falling apart. And we read about this constantly, and there's good reason for concern. I won't argue that there isn't. But what I'd like to emphasize in my very short words of introduction is something quite different than the kind of anxiety and alarm that I think many of us share. I think it goes to the heart of some of the things that we'll be talking about, that Eva and Peter will be talking about. So I think, and this has become a cliche, but I think important to repeat, that this crisis is also an opportunity. Many try to fight and to maintain the status quo, to turn the wheel back, to safeguard reality as we used to know it. But a crisis is also an opportunity to think forward, to imagine a different kind of future, to think about questions that we've set aside and we thought we didn't need to deal with. And it's an opportunity to go back to these questions and put them back on the table and discuss them. One dimension, definitely not the only one, in our polarized society is the Palestinian issue, Palestinian citizens in Israel, and obviously Palestinians in the West Bank, but also other kinds of tensions between religion and secularism, between periphery and center. These are the kind of questions that a crisis of the kind that we're experiencing bring back to the foreground. The opportunity is there also because what we're facing are not sort of just the developments of the last few months or even the last few years and go beyond Trump and Netanyahu. These are long-term processes that we now see erupting to the surface. But the fact that these are long-term processes also, I think, suggests that these are deep kinds of complexities and divides. And part of what I believe polarization tries to do is flatten these complexities and suggest that what we're facing are clear binaries. And I think we need to try and think beyond them. And the depth of these fundamental differences, I think, also suggests that they're not one-dimensional. And that opens up possibilities for thinking differently about the future. If polarization is a political strategy, the way to fight it is not necessarily best served by accentuating the differences, but also by trying to build bridges or new bridges among Jews, of course, but also between Jews and Palestinians, and having a different vision of this place. This is what the Leer Institute is committed to doing, and I think that we have an opportunity to think about some of these questions this evening, since we are very fortunate to have with us two critical minds who are at one and the same time, I think both, and I'll introduce them separately in a minute, but one at a time, both are highly reflective and critical about the current situation, but also extremely committed to making this place a better one, who, despite their critiques of Israel that go very deep, continue to self-identify, I believe, as Zionists, who have alternative homelands, in a way, in the US and perhaps in France, but are committed to improving this place, who are simultaneously concerned with discrimination and inequality in Israel and about anti-Semitism abroad, and who continue to believe in the possibility of a different future, perhaps of a Zionist dream, which was always also a critical vision and one that tries to imagine a better future. So now let me briefly move to introducing our two speakers for this evening. I'll begin with our guest from abroad, Eva, with your permission. So I'll introduce first Mr. Peter Beinart, a renowned American journalist and a prolific writer. He worked for the highly influential The New Republic for over a decade and was its editor from 1999 to 2006. At present, Peter Beinart is a senior political writer at the blog The Daily Beast and an associate professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, and a Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New American Foundation. Beinart has written for Time, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and several other important periodicals. He is also the author of the eye-opening book, The Good Fight, Why Liberals, and Only Liberals, Can Win the War on Terror and Make America Great Again, from 2006. In the American Jewish community, Beinart carries an important voice. He has published several, I think, in terms of American Jewish politics, path-breaking pieces, challenging the mainstream Jewish establishment under titles such as, and I'm quoting, "I No Longer Believe in a Jewish State," debunking the myth that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and Yavne, a Jewish case for equality in Israel-Palestine. Just to quote briefly a few lines from that last article, Peter asks, what makes someone a Jew? Not just a Jew in name, but a Jew in good standing today. In Haredi circles, being a real Jew means adhering to religious law. In leftist Jewish spaces, it means championing progressive causes. But these environments are the exceptions. In the broad center of Jewish life, where power and respectability lie, being a Jew means, above all, supporting the existence of a Jewish state. In most Jewish communities on earth, rejecting Israel is a greater heresy than rejecting God. And then he moves in a critical way to question some of the underlying presuppositions of Israel as a Jewish state in a way that I think is telling, because it, as I mentioned, simultaneously is a critique from within, a critique of someone committed to the future of this place. Professor Eva Illouz needs perhaps less of an introduction for an Israeli audience, but still, she is a world-renowned sociologist, holds a position at both Hebrew University and at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. She studies the sociology of capitalism as well as the sociology of emotions, and she's published numerous books with brilliant titles, including Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Life and Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism, Why Love Hurts, A Sociological Explanation, and Unloving, A Sociology of Negative Relations. And most recent book, which has come out in several languages already and will shortly come out in Hebrew at Leer, is The Emotional Life of Populism, How Fear, Disgust, Resentment, and Love Undermine Democracy. She is, as we all know, also a public intellectual and has published in a variety of venues in Israel and abroad. Most importantly, at least for me, she's also a senior fellow at the Leer Institute and a wonderful presence here. I'd like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank Peter for coming from afar, and Eva, as well as the audience and the people at Leer who have made this occasion possible. Thank you, Shulamit Laron, and thank you for all the rest of the Leer team members who have been involved. I am looking forward to hearing your conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah. Thanks very much, Shai. I want to start and say something personal, namely that it is really meaningful for me to meet you. It's not always the case that it's meaningful for me to meet fellow academics and intellectuals. And it's especially meaningful for me to meet you at this time in Israel, and for two reasons. One is that you are what Michael Walzer calls a critic from inside. Michael Walzer has this distinction between the critic on the mountain, the one who speaks from above and from far, and the critic from inside, the prophet, for example, the prophet who feels a part of the people whom he admonishes. And Peter definitely belongs to that prophetic tradition. He is very much inside, and he criticizes from inside, and that's why I think his voice has so much poignancy. The second reason is not intellectual as the other one. It's really personal. I made Aliyah as an observant Jew from France, and perhaps because Europe is soaked with the blood of Jews, French Jews never had the freedom to think about Israel in the way American Jews have. Like many French Jews, I arrived in Israel with a very naive vision of Israel and Zionism. I thought Israel was the moral leader and the moral center of the Jewish people. In 2010, I remember exactly where I was. I was reading the New York Review of Books. I was reading an article by somebody whose name I had never heard, Peter Beinart, and it was called The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment. And it would really not be an exaggeration to say that it was for me like a thunderstorm in a sunny afternoon. In this article, Beinart exposed the increasing disaffection of young Americans for Israel. Something which, in my complete naivete, I had never thought possible, because in my mind, diaspora and Israel were indissociable. And Beinart described the fact that Israel had actually very much receded from the consciousness of many young people. That is, Israel simply did not interest them. It was not a kind of breakup with histrionics and bitterness, and recriminations, but it was a quasi-indifference. Israel had dropped out of their minds. And in this article, Peter, you suggest that many of the secular Zionists who supported Israel were shaped by the terrifying days that led to the Six-Day War and by the bitter aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, when much of the world seemed to turn against the Jewish state. And so Israel became really central to their identity, often in conjunction with the memory of the Holocaust. And you say rather ominously that these secular Zionists aren't reproducing themselves. I think you're right. They are not reproducing themselves because history has changed, and also because there is, I think, a new and profound fracture in the Jewish people between religious and secular, and it is the former, the religious, which seem to reproduce themselves just fine. Now, we know a few characteristics about religious people. Usually, they tend to be more socially conservative. They're politically more likely to vote to the right. They tend to be they tend to oppose feminism, gay marriage, and to look at Jewish religious and ethnic supremacy with understanding, if not approval. And I want to quote from a piece that Leon Wieseltier wrote in his magazine Liberties. I quote him: "The chief rabbinate of Israel is the most poisonous institution in contemporary Jewish life, which years ago was taken over by the least enlightened and least humane elements in the Israeli ultra-Orthodox community. The chief rabbinate was not created by God at Sinai. It was created in 1920 by an ordinance of the British mandatory authorities in Palestine. It is a pontifical office in a religion that has no pope. The basis of its authority is not halachic, but political. It is an engine of exclusion, a pitiless enemy of Jewish unity." These are very strong words. And so my first question is, would you agree that there is perhaps a great deal of similarity, not equivalence, but similarity between the ways in which American Jewish community and the Israeli collective are split by religion? That is, a certain version of orthodoxy, ultra-Orthodox in America, and in Israel I think it would be the ultra-Orthodox and the Messianic Orthodox, which has been profoundly anti-modern and anti-liberal, that is responsible, partly, not exclusively, for the split we are witnessing, and that there is perhaps no way to bridge over the chasm that has opened.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Well, it's just really a great honor to be here. I've so admired Van Leer and have learned so much from the scholars here, some of whom are in the room here, like my friend Bashir and many others. And it's also just particularly meaningful for me because when you're someone like me who's very, very critical, not just of the Israeli government, but actually critical of the whole notion of a Jewish state, you kind of think, how do I maintain a connection to this place? Like, I was at the Kotel on Friday night and someone took a picture, which I didn't think you were supposed to do at the Kotel on Shabbat, and someone put it online and basically said, "What? Beinart is such a hypocrite. He's at the Kotel," you know, like somehow I'm supposed to be an outcast even there, you know. So it's just very meaningful to me to be in a place where I feel in conversation with people who share similar principles, even if we may disagree on certain things. And if you are one of the people here who strongly disagrees with some of the things I say, then I'm particularly grateful to you for coming, because I think people too often only listen to those who they already agree with. I do think there are some similarities between the dynamics among American Jews and Israeli Jews. One is certainly the kind of demographic self-confidence of Orthodox Jews in both places. In both places, you had this dynamic in the middle of the 20th century when Orthodoxy was considered to be a kind of a museum to the past, and that turned out to be exactly wrong. And now there is, I think, a sense of kind of dread, demographic dread among the kind of more liberal strains of American Jewry, and so I think there is some similarity. There's certainly a similarity in a kind of consistency of kind of greater religious observance, greater orthodoxy, and more right-wing politics. The American Jewish community overall votes about 75% for the Democratic Party very consistently, but Orthodox Jews now quite consistently vote 75% for the Republican Party. And so similarly here, obviously, you find that Haredi and Dati Jews are much more likely to vote to the right than Chiloni Jews. So those are similarities. The differences, though, start with the fact that, of course, American Jews are just 2% of the population. So our internal dynamics are cast against this much larger tableau of American politics in general. And so even though Orthodox Jews are demographically ascendant in the United States, which is to say Orthodox Jews are, let's say, 10% of American Jews, but there are a much higher percentage of American Jews under the age of 5. And there are a much higher percentage of American Jews who are affiliated with a synagogue. So in that sense, you see that trend is similar. On the other hand, American society as a whole is becoming much more secular. Among Christians, religious affiliation is in collapse. People may still say they believe in God, but the percentage of Christians who are actually going to church is dramatically down, especially among working class white American Christians. And so, in a sense, while American Jewry may be becoming more orthodox and therefore eventually over time perhaps even more politically conservative, American society as a whole is becoming more secular, more non-white, and probably generally for those reasons more politically progressive. Now, and one of the reasons I think for the Trump phenomenon and what's happened to the Republican Party is the Republican Party has, seeing this demographic shift, has moved in a whole series of different ways to make it harder for that emerging demographic majority to express itself politically, to vote. Part of what, when Donald Trump says they're stealing the election, one of the things he's essentially saying is all of these black people and Muslims and immigrants who are voting are essentially not really legitimate members of the American political system. And the Republican Party expresses that in a lot of ways. So I think for that reason, although I think for that reason, you could see this in the figures of like Obama and Netanyahu, for instance. These are societies that in some significant ways are moving in different directions. And I think the reason that defending the character of the Jewish state is becoming harder and harder, not just a particular government, but the very notion of a Jewish state, or to use a more provocative term, a Jewish supremacist state. The reason that's going to become harder and harder in American progressive circles is precisely because American progressives see that Israel is the model for the American right. That what many on the American right want is a country that is owned by a particular ethnic, religious, racial tribe. They see Israel as embodying that, and it's precisely because Americans on the left see themselves struggling against our own version of ethno-nationalism, the attempt to make America into a white Christian state, and fighting against that for the principle of equality under the law, that I think it becomes harder for American progressives to defend the notion of an ethno-nationalist state, a state with a particular obligation to one ethnic religious group, when we see that presence as so menacing, that vision is so menacing in our own country.
Thank you, Peter. By the way, sometimes my questions will be short, sometimes they will be long. That's just the way I ask questions. You have, I think, very convincingly argued that Zionism, the Zionism of Herzl, cannot be legitimate without democracy. And I think you refer to Alte Neuland, which was a utopian novel written by Herzl in 1902. And the novel imagines the Israel of the 1920s, and it is an Israel, on the whole, remarkably similar to the one we have come to know. It is economically successful. It provides welfare to its inhabitants. It has a rich and vibrant cultural scene, even an opera, which was dear to Herzl. And if you look at Israel's Declaration of Independence, you could almost think that Israel also implemented the political program of Herzl, which was to have democracy. I quote to you from Article 13 of the Declaration of Independence. The State of Israel will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. However, I think we know now that Israel has been, from the start, far more deficient than Herzl had imagined on democracy, human rights, and equality. These deficiencies did not start with the current government, but were, so to speak, embedded in the state from the beginning, as Israel was constituted as an ethnic democracy, giving more rights to the Jews, and as a religious one, because religion and the state were tightly intertwined in all kinds of subtle and non-subtle ways. Now, I think that if you look at the current government, which wants to do away with a little democratic safeguard that existed, and the current protests, we can say that there are two camps among the protesters. There is a camp that thinks that this government represents only radicalization of tendencies or structural flaws that existed previously, and that without a very serious overhaul of Israel's legal and political system, you will not be able to achieve a society in which Arab and Jews are full and equal citizens. And there is a camp of those who think that however imperfect Israeli democracy was, it's worthwhile to go back to the status quo ante, to the way things were. So this might be, a terrain you don't want to go into, I'm not sure. But I was curious to know where you stand on this issue and whether you think this government might be a kind of grotesque and caricatural version of the ethnocratic and theocratic streaks that were built in the state rather than a radical break from the state? Or do you think that a return to the status quo ante would be good enough? In other words, is the return to the status quo ante a medicine we should take at all costs? Or will it be more likely to be like a Band-Aid on a festering wound that can heal only with a drastic medical intervention?
I think I would incline towards the second position. It was Benny Gantz, not Benjamin Netanyahu, who decided that the major Palestinian human rights organizations in the West Bank should be declared illegal, and then sent the IDF to go and ransack their offices and weld shut their doors. It was not the Netanyahu government that oversaw the Supreme Court decision. It was this Supreme Court that ruled that Israel could expel every single member of the villages of Masafer Yatta and destroy all of their homes. Yair Lapid uses the word state for all its citizens as an epithet, something he said he fought against for his entire life. So for me, those seem to be quite profound. Those seem to be the actions of people who are quite profoundly opposed to the idea of equality under the law and liberal democracy as it applies to Palestinians. I understand that there are people, I am not an insider to Israeli political discourse, and I know that there are people who believe that sequentially one has to fight against the judicial overhaul efforts, essentially as if there were no Palestinians, in the hopes that you can win that fight and then move on to the Palestinians, because if you talk about Palestinians, you become discredited in the eyes of the right. But I guess I'm skeptical about whether people in the political center, I think of people like Gantz and Lapid, who, as far as I can tell, have never shown any particular interest in the rights of Palestinians before, would suddenly discover one after they managed to defeat Netanyahu and Simcha Rotman on this. And I also just, again, maybe this is the American in me, but it seems to me, if you're going to build a movement for liberal democracy, such a movement can't fundamentally be a sectarian movement. It can't be a movement that's led by Jews and responsive primarily to the concerns of Jews. That the most powerful kind of democracy movement in Israel would put at its center the people who have the least democracy today, and those are the people who live under the control of a state of which they cannot become citizens, whose government dominates their lives, often decides whether they live or die, and yet they can't vote for it. And those are the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. That would be for me why a return to the status quo before Netanyahu wouldn't solve the fundamental questions. But I say that as an outsider, so I try to say with some humility about not living here and not having an intimate understanding of the political culture, but that's how things look for me from abroad.
So it's the first position, in fact, of the two positions
I presented. I thought okay, so maybe it was the first. It's not going back to the status quo.
Yeah. Okay. So we are in agreement. Yes. So I want to quote you. Someone you are probably quite familiar with, Elliot Abrams, who has been an American politician who has served in various Republican and conservative governments like those of Reagan and Bush and Trump. And he has argued quite recently that Israel is changing and that American Jews must accept the changes. I quote him now. The 1950s or 1960s Israel of labor socialism may have resembled the Upper West Side, but the Israel that is developing before our eyes does not. It is truly a Jewish state, increasingly peopled, and in part now governed by Jews who believe in the God of the Hebrew Bible, and for whom the practice of the religion of Judaism is the most important aspect of their lives. He continues, can American Jews accept this Israel, or will it alienate all but the Orthodox who practice the same religion? Now, my question is, what would you answer Elliot Abrams? After all, Hungary, India, Turkey, Italy have moved toward deeply illiberal proto-fascist regimes. So I want to ask, why not Israel? The older nations I mentioned, more than that, seem actually to flourish and are not boycotted, as far as I can tell, by the Western world. So why wouldn't that be the case for Israel?
I think this analogy, this idea that Israel is on its way to becoming like Hungary, for instance, is misplaced. Because again, I think it looks at things fundamentally from within a Jewish framework. Perhaps it could be that if Netanyahu and his allies get its way, that Israel could become more like Hungary for Israeli Jews. But for Palestinians, Israel has been far worse than Hungary, not just in its more religious incarnation now, but in the quote-unquote good old days of the 1950s and 60s, when Palestinian citizens were held under military law. and needed military permission to stay overnight if they lived in much of Israel to leave their villages, right? So it seems to me more like Israel is a much more advanced version of ethnocracy and that India, Hungary, France, Italy aspire to move, and the United States aspire to move in Israel's direction, but they all have a long way to go. I mean, look at Modi is trying to turn India from being a country that defined itself as a secular state into being a Hindu nationalist state. And he's moving along that line. But and his opponents in the Congress Party and others, weak as they are, still defend the principle of the idea of India as a secular state, which does not privilege any religious group. In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu's centrist or center-left opponents, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, do not stand for the principle of equality under the law, a state for all its citizens. They reject it. They believe in a somewhat more, I would say, polite version of this kind of ethno-nationalism. I think one of the reasons that there is a crisis among, let's say, non-Orthodox American Jews. There are many American non-Orthodox Jews who just particularly don't care about Israel very much at all. They're very deeply assimilated. They're disconnected. But for those who do care, I think the fundamental, the reason that I think the position that was always called progressive except Palestine is kind of under so much pressure on the American left, among American liberals, is it required you to say that in America you believe passionately in the principle that the country treats everybody equally, irrespective of race, religion, and ethnicity. And in Israel, you believe passionately that the country should give supremacy to members of one ethno-religious group. And as Israel has become more and more of a model for people on the American right, it's clearer and clearer to many progressive American Jews that the Israelification of the United States would be very dangerous for diaspora, for American Jews. People often, talk about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But if you dig into the data, I think it's quite clear that you find the most anti-Semitism in the United States among people who are quite fervently Zionist on the American right. And the reason this is not a contradiction is they believe that the home for Jews is Israel, not the United States. They believe that every country should be owned by a tribe, and that Jews have their country owned by a tribe, which is great. It's Israel, but their country is not the United States. I don't know how much this made it into the Israeli press, but one of the odd verbal tics of Donald Trump was that when speaking to American Jewish audiences, he very frequently would say things like, "Your Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu," "Your country, Israel." And people found that a little jarring. But in Trump's ethno-nationalist view, it made perfect sense that Jews have the right to dominate and control this territory, but are essentially guests everywhere else, which I think is also the way someone like Viktor Orban sees it. And that's why I think that the Democratic Party will, over time, move towards a position of supporting full equality in Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. So this is a kind of longish observation. Because I kind of I followed an arc from being stunned by the idea that American Jewish community in Israel might be actually parting ways to thinking, in fact, it could be a good thing. So this is my observation or statement. If you look at the pre-war independence years, as well as the years which came after the establishment of the State of Israel, I think we can say that from time to time there were episodes of national unity. That is, moments where Jews and Israelis put their differences aside in order to achieve some goal. I can think of 3 examples. There are probably many more. The first is the famous status quo agreement signed in 1947, which was an understanding reached between Ben-Gurion and then chairman of the Jewish Agency and the religious Agudat Israel. In the later, which was the agreement, Ben-Gurion stipulated that Jewish laws will be protected. You know, most of you know what I'm talking about. It was about Shabbat and the kashrut and family laws and marriage and divorce and education, autonomy of the Orthodox education. Ben-Gurion promised that the state will not infringe on the religious philosophy or conscience of any part of the Jewish people. So we can say here that both Ben-Gurion and Aguda actually worked together for unity and pragmatic politics. Second example, on June 1st, 1948, Begin signed an agreement with a provisional government headed by David Ben-Gurion, and the Irgun, which was the underground military organization headed by Begin, agreed to formally disband and to integrate its force with the newly formed Israel Defense Forces, which was identified with a rival party. Third example, on the day before the outbreak of the June 1967 war, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol brought opposition parties Herut, which was before the Likud, Gachal and Rafi into the ruling coalition. And even though Eshkol had already 75 seats out of the 120 seats in the Knesset. And by the way, this unity government remained in power for 38 months. So what I'm trying to say is this. There are moments when Jews and Israelis have found a way to put political disagreement on the side in order to create or maintain the unity of the people. And this idea of Achdut Ha'am, the unity of the Jewish people, is incredibly strong. It is incredibly strong, I think, both in the religious praxis and theory and in Israeli nationalism. And so, despite frequent dissensions and factionalism, often you find occasions where groups manage to pull themselves together. What we are witnessing now, I think, is new, in my opinion, and it is that politics has taken the forefront of our identity, both on the left and on the right side of the political map. This is congruent, by the way, with findings in America as well, where political identity is much more important today than other forms of identity. It has become what's called a mega identity. So this is true both for the left and for the right. And so while there were moments, as I said, where the unity of the Jewish people could trump these allegiances, this is no longer the case. For me, Rabin's assassination marked the eruption of the political, of this new order in the public sphere. And this no longer allowed, I think, for the unity of the Jewish people. So, would you agree that political identity on the right and on the left has actually taken over all other forms of identity? Even religious identity is actually maybe also a political identity in disguise. And so that was my first question. This is where I want to draw the parallel between American Jews, especially the younger Jews that you have discussed, who hold universalist and liberal values and for whom these values take precedence over their commitment to Judaism and Israel. And for the extreme Messianic right, it is the Jewish control of the biblical land and possibly the renewal of the Third Temple which has taken precedence over the unity of the Jewish people. So would you agree that we have entered into an era in which define themselves primarily by their political commitment and ideology. And also, that's the second part of my question, that this is perhaps actually a very good thing, because it lays bare more clearly the fact that the groups which were involved in the creation of the state had in mind, in fact, very different projects. And that now is the time to really put this on the table and no longer hide behind the useful fiction of the unity of the people.
I do think that you're right about the United States, that political identity is a much more salient feature of the way people think about themselves. When I was growing up, being a Democrat or a Republican was not nearly as important to one's identity, partly because the Democratic and the Republican Party were not as ideologically coherent. So you could be on quite progressive, but you knew that there were Democrats who were actually quite conservative. You didn't really, you didn't agree with them at all, or vice versa. The two parties have become much more ideologically homogenous. And what's happened in the American Jewish community is the center of the American Jewish community religiously has collapsed. And that is part of the reason that the center politically is collapsing. So the center of the Jewish community religiously were highly affiliated non-Orthodox Jews. The people who tended to run the American Jewish organizations were members of Reform and conservative synagogues. They were not halachic in any sense. They might have actually been extremely bored in synagogue when they rarely went. But they had markers of affiliation. They were what I call secular tribalists. Their religion was really the Jewish people, as they saw it, the survival of the Jewish people. So, and they were Democrats, moderate liberals, and passionate, we could call liberal Zionists, right? I don't think in practice their Zionism was really that liberal, but it would have been associated with the kind of Labor Party, let's say. Now, those people, the membership in those synagogues is collapsing, and where you see the demographic growth is among Orthodox Jews and among non-affiliated, highly assimilated Jews. So the children of these secular tribalists tend to be secular universalists. And the reason that groups like AIPAC are sustaining themselves, AIPAC in particular, is that even though the children of the leaders of AIPAC are generally not joining AIPAC, those 70 and 80-year-olds who are secular tribalists are being replaced by modern Orthodox Jews. So if you go to like the AIPAC convention today, and you go to Morning Minyan, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of people there, right? That was not the case. If you go back to the 1970s, it wasn't even the norm that you served kosher food in Jewish organizations. It was a much more secular ethos. In fact, I love this. I was told a great story when I was reading my book years ago, that a guy was working, a guy was working at the Anti-Defamation League. So you may know that's the group that fights against anti-Semitism. So it was Friday, it was the winter, so Shabbat came in early. And so he said to his boss, I would like to leave early for Shabbat. And his boss at the Anti-Defamation League said, no, you can't. And so the man said, this guy who was Orthodox, he said it was very strange, because if I had been working anywhere else, I would have called the Anti-Defamation League. But I was working at the Anti-Defamation League. Like, that was the culture of American Jewish organizational life in the 1970s. It's completely transformed. And so this center of these secular tribalists has really collapsed, and you have very universalistic secular Jews who are, many of whom don't really care about Israel, but many of them who care enough to be engaged actually don't necessarily find the idea of a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians, or for that matter anywhere else, quite difficult to swallow. And then you have an Orthodox population that's highly nationalistic, for whom the religious observance has become deeply woven up with political nationalism. And I think, to me, what's in some ways sad about, I mean, there are many things that are worrying about this, but one of the things that's worrying about it is, I think, it seems to me one of the value of being engaged in a religious tradition is to feel its alienness, to read texts that are ancient texts and just can't be confined to the modern categories that we think about them, right? And that you feel this sense that I'm connected to these texts. On the other hand, they are profoundly challenging to me because so many of their assumptions are so radically different than mine. And I think that the importance of politics, I think, makes that less likely to happen in both the left and the right. I mean, the right is probably more engaged in these texts, but has turned these texts into such a vehicle for religious nationalism. And I think oftentimes when progressive American Jews do engage with the text at all, they cherry pick a few lines here and there that sound like, you know, they were written by the Democratic Socialists or America. They're highly Republican. And I think that that's such an impoverished way of engaging with a religious tradition at all, you know, and that's one of the things that worries me.
Thank you. How about unity?
I don't know. I mean, maybe we exaggerate the degree to which there was ever unity. I do think one can look at the middle of the 20th century, let's say from the Holocaust through up until maybe it will look that there was maybe that there was a period of time in which Zionism was hegemonic among Jews across the world. But it certainly was not between 1900 and 1945. I think in the United States, its hegemony is waning. It's still hegemonic at the organizational level. But when people do polling, it's funny, actually. Generally, the Jewish organizations don't like to ask these questions. Because if they ask the questions, the answers they get are so subversive that they would rather not ask the questions at all. So, but just to give one example, a fascinating example from a Canadian political scientist named Mira Sukharov. So Mira Sukharov asked American Jews if they consider themselves Zionists. But she did something which they almost never do, which is she gave various different definitions of Zionism. So she said, do you consider yourself Zionist if it means having a connection to the state of Israel? And people said yes, overwhelmingly. And then she said, do you consider yourself a Zionist if it means you support a Jewish and democratic state? And so people said yes, right? That's just a catechism. They said yes. Then she said, do you consider yourself Zionist if being a Zionist means you support a state that gives Jews rights that Palestinians don't have? So Jews, legal privileges over Palestinians. 69% of American Jews said no, right? Under that category, they're anti-Zionists, right? But that actually is the reality of the state of Israel, inside the Green Line as well, right? And so it suggests that the more people become aware of that, the more their supposed, sacrosanct Zionism, actually, that it's quite thinner, actually, than one might imagine.
Wonderful. I have 3 more questions, 1 long, 2 short. So I start with a long one. When Prime Minister Netanyahu chose to support Donald Trump before and after the presidential election in 2016, some people could still give him the benefit of the doubt. Trump was surrounded by people like Steve Bannon, the former head of Breitbart News, which reeked of racism and anti-Semitism, but no one was sure of the direction which the new presidency would take. Trump refused to condemn his anti-Semitic base or the Ku Klux Klan, which had enthusiastically backed him, and it took him a long time to dissociate himself from David Duke. But the events in Charlottesville in August 2017 no longer allowed for doubt. The neo-Nazi demonstrators committed violent acts against peaceful protesters, killed 1 woman, and Trump reacted to the events by saying there were fine people on both sides. The world was shocked by this conflation of the 2 groups, but Jerusalem stayed mum. Now, if you're a benevolent observer, you could say that this silence might have been due to the fact that Israel is closely dependent on American military aid. But this interpretation became quickly untenable. Before and since Charlottesville, Netanyahu courted other leaders who were either unbothered by anti-Semitism or straightforwardly sympathetic to it, and upon whom Israel is not economically dependent. Hungary. Under the government of Orban, the country legitimized anti-Semitism. In 2015, for example, the Hungarian government erected a statue to commemorate Balint Homan, a Holocaust-era minister who played a decisive role in the murder or deportation of nearly 600,000 Hungarian Jews. In 2016, another statue was erected in tribute to Georgi Donat, one of the architects of anti-Jewish legislation during World War II. Orban himself used anti-Semitic tropes during his re-election campaign in 2017, especially against George Soros, who is an American philanthropist who supports liberal causes. Whom, by the way, did Netanyahu choose to support? Not the anxious Hungarian Jewish community who protested bitterly against the anti-Semitic actions of Orban's government, nor did he choose to support the liberal Soros who defends humanitarian causes. More recently, the minister Amichai Shikli, Minister of Diaspora Affairs, supported Elon Musk's anti-Semitic attack on Soros as being a person who hates humanity. U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, tweeted that irrespective of how one feels about George Soros' politics or policies, it is entirely disingenuous to deny that many ad hominem attacks on him rely on classic anti-Semitic tropes and rhetoric. This last weekend, Yuval Noah Harari published an article suggesting that the rhetoric deployed by the current government against the protesters is entirely anti-Semitic. He says that these protesters are accused of being cosmopolitan and disloyal to the nation, the kind of anti-Semitic accusations you could hear about the Jews in pre-World War II Europe. And this is my last example. Éric Zemmour, the far-right French Jewish politician, had the nerve of campaigning on the claim that Pétain protected French Jews by sending foreign Jews to their death. He also made a scandalous parallel between the family of Mohamed Merah, the terrorist who killed Jewish children in Toulouse, and because the family of Mohamed Merah had asked to bury their son in Algeria, and the family of Samuel Sandlers, who had asked that the father and the son who had been murdered during the terror attack be buried in Israel. Zemmour said that both families were not really French. Where did Zemmour do his highest score? In Israel, where he garnered 53% of the vote. So we really have, I think, a spectacular reversal of roles and identities. There is incredible confusion that reigns, where Israel can no longer be considered as a plausible and credible agent in the struggle against anti-Semitism. It ignores neo-Nazis on the one hand. It accuses humanitarian Jews or Israeli patriots or, the extreme rightist Zemmour to bury their children in Israel is disloyal. So my question is, where does this leave people like you and me who are trying not only to make this place a better place, but also to fight anti-Semitism? Doesn't it mean that the vocation of Israel as a shelter state for persecuted Jews from anti-Semitism is seriously jeopardized?
So I think fundamentally there is a battle about what anti-Semitism is and how to define it, right? So I think for the Israeli government and for the pro-Israel establishment organizations that tend to dominate Jewish communities in the United States and Europe, the most pernicious form of anti-Semitism is questioning the moral legitimacy of the state of Israel. If that's the basis of I think that's the reason for this effort to try to get the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism enshrined everywhere. It's because it equates calling Israel a racist state or questioning Jewish sovereignty, it suggests that's an example of anti-Semitism. If you believe that, and there are many people who genuinely do, then your perception of anti-Semitism in the world looks very different, right? Then you see a great deal of anti-Semitism on the left, because it is on the left where you see more anti-Zionism, more of a questioning of the moral legitimacy of the idea of a Jewish state. And so you naturally want to fight against that. And so you might see Donald Trump and progressive Democrats as equal threats, or maybe the progressive Democrats as even greater threats. And I think there's no unanimity on this. There are splits even in all of the diaspora communities themselves. And I think fundamentally, to me, to go back to the point I made earlier, to me, fundamentally, it goes back to one's view of ethno-nationalism. Do you believe that Jews are ultimately safer in a world in which states are the property of one tribe and everybody else is a kind of a guest there? If that's your view, then Israel fits it very, very well. But you also have to accept that in Hungary or in France or in the United States, there's going to be a tribe that controls and dominates and defines that state, and Jews are not members of that tribe. And Jews will be guests in that place. But the good news is they have their own country that is dominated by a tribe, and they can always go there and be safe, right? That's one vision. And there are plenty of Jews in all these diaspora communities who basically take that view. The other view is that Jews are safer in a world of equality under the law, in which we fight in all countries for visions of citizenship that don't privilege people based on race or religion or ethnicity. And I think, to me, as the child of South Africans, I often think about this scene from the Rivonia trial, where all the Jews where all the white defendants were Jews, along with Mandela being the most famous of the defendant, and the prosecutor, Percy Uttar, was also a Jew. Actually, the president of a large synagogue in Johannesburg, and in many ways, Percy Uttar had a vision about Jewish self-interest. Right? His vision about Jewish self-interest was that Jews should accept that South Africa would be essentially an Afrikaner-dominated country, and that Jews should pledge loyalty, exhibit their loyalty to that state, and therefore they would be kept safe. And I think that the Jews associated with Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and there are many of them, and they're very influential, I think have basically that view. They believe it's fine for this to be a white Christian America, as long as Jews show loyalty to that white Christian America, Jews will be okay. And besides that, that white Christian America will be loyal to Israel, and that ultimately is the most important thing for Jewish safety.
I feel very short. So I have two now short questions. You have written in a 2020 article, "It is time to imagine a Jewish home that would not be a Jewish state." So I wanted to ask you, please, if you can tell us how you came to that conclusion, because I don't think you always thought that. And then I was wondering if you could tell me what that home would be. I'm not asking about the formal political arrangements such as how we would organize such a state politically. I'm asking about the things that make... I'm referring to the fact that most citizens of the world feel at home somewhere. That's funny. So most citizens throughout the world feel at home in a state because they have a shared history, a shared language, a sense of common destiny, and what Aristotle called the will to live together. So what would a home, a Jewish home, look like that is not a Jewish state?
So this idea is not unique, not something that it was original to me at all. There were many important Zionist figures, starting with Echad Ha'am and then going through binationalists like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus and others, who believed in the importance of a Jewish society in Israel-Palestine that could do a kind of cultural production that would have an impact on Jews around the world. But they didn't necessarily, or in some place emphatically oppose the idea of a Jewish state. I was mentioning earlier, Dmitry Shumsky's book Beyond the Nation State actually even argues that a lot of people we think of as political Zionists were not sold on the idea of Jewish statehood until fairly late. So this equation of Zionism with Jewish sovereignty or Jewish statehood, which I think we take for granted, was much less the case in earlier periods in the 20th century before the creation of the state. For me, I think that my support for my entire adult life for two states was a kind of a reflection of the idea that at the heart of Judaism itself was this balance or this tension between universalism and particularism, right? Which I think makes Judaism different than Christianity or Islam, because Judaism is a religion with a universal moral message, but it's also the story of a family in the book of Genesis that becomes a nation in the book of Exodus, and that nation is imagined as an extended family, right? Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, right? And so it seems to me that having a Jewish state to protect and represent Jews alongside a Palestinian state, so Jews were not ruling over millions of Palestinians who lacked citizenship in the country, who were under the control of a state where they couldn't gain citizenship, would be a way of squaring that circle between our special obligations to each other as Jews and our moral obligations to all people, in this case to Palestinians. I think the problem I had, was that year in and year out, making this argument for partition, I began to feel that it was less and less credible. I just had this, I heard it ringing in my ear and on my computer screen that it started to ring more and more false. Because I was one of many, many, many people, and there's still many of them out there, who will tell you that it's 5 minutes to midnight for the two-state solution, and it's almost dead. It's on its deathbed. The doctor is just there. It's only got a last couple of breaths. But they said that 10 years ago. And they said that 20 years ago, and it looks all likelihood they'll be saying it 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. You can't have something which is perpetually on death's door. At some point, it dies. And now, I don't obviously have some mathematical equation, but it seemed to me I was challenged by Palestinian friends and interlocutors to say, at what point are you willing to say, this does no longer seems like a plausible vision, and I will consider alternatives? And so I felt like I needed to do that. And I also began to think beyond that the idea of partition just doesn't solve very fundamental problems. It solves certain problems, right? But it doesn't solve the problem that Palestinian citizens will still want to be equals, full equals, no matter what happens in Ramallah. In Haifa or Jaffa or Lod, they will want full equality, as any of us would. And the Israeli state, if it's a Jewish state, can't give them that. And in fact, the Jewish state can't even deal with their demographic growth, right? Because the more their numbers increased and they were able to contest for power, the more they would challenge the notion of Jewish statehood. And of course, the idea of partition can't, in the kind of way it's generally envisioned by most liberal Zionist Jews, can't deal with the idea that Palestinian refugees want to return. And I found that when I was speaking for Jewish audiences, it was very easy to say something along the lines of, everybody knows that once there's a two-state solution, that the Palestinians will basically give up on the idea of refugee return, and only a symbolic number of people will come, and everyone would kind of nod and feel very reassured by that, right? But when I spoke to Palestinians, they would ask me impolite questions, like, Peter, you weren't born here. Your parents were not born here. Your grandparents were not born here. Explain to me why it is fair for you to be able to come and move to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Haifa and get citizenship on day one when I was born here, or my parents were born here, or my grandparents were, and I cannot? I just didn't have a good answer to that question, you know? And so I began to kind of ask myself, well, what about the people who had done the work? And there were many, many people, mostly Palestinians, but not only Palestinians, who had been thinking about the idea of equality within one integrated political unit. And I read a lot of that writing and talked to people and began to think that essentially the question was, what kind of one state do I think is likely to be more peaceful and more humane over the long term? The kind of one state where most of the Palestinians are essentially colonial subjects because they live under the control of a state whose government they can't vote for, they can't become citizens of it, and they live under a different legal system, right? That's 80% of the Palestinians under Israeli control, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Or a state where everyone has the right to vote. And when I read comparative political science research about divided societies, one of the points that came through was that deeply divided societies tend to be more peaceful and more stable when everyone has a voice in government. Because when one group doesn't have a voice in government, it tends to try to respond violently. But when people are enfranchised and they have a voice in government, politics can be very, very, very messy. But what you have is politics, you know. And again, maybe I'm influenced as the child of South Africans by remembering how many people were sure that when apartheid ended, the ANC and its military wing would take the opportunity to go on a mass killing spree. And instead, what happened was that Mkhonto weSizwe, the military wing of the ANC, disbanded because it had no reason to exist anymore because black South Africans could vote. The same reason that the IRA had no more reason to have a military wing once Catholics in Northern Ireland could express themselves politically, rather than having to take up arms in order to try to get the state to hear them. So I don't think that, you know, it may be the case that, you know, people say, what happens if there's no longer a Jewish majority? There's not a Jewish majority now. Majority of the people between the river and the sea a small majority are Palestinian now. Right? So the question is whether you think in the long term Jews will be safer if those people have the right to vote and the right to actually petition the government nonviolently, or whether you're basically going to cast them in this position in which the government is totally unaccountable to them and can brutalize them on a daily basis. I think that Jews would, I'm not a prophet, but I think that, again, if you look at what's happened when legal equality came to South Africa, or to Northern Ireland, or even to the United States, the dirty little secret is not that the previously oppressed group, the previously dominant group was killed or subjugated. It's actually how many of their privileges they maintained, right? I mean, that's the dirty little secret about the dirty little secret is even under conditions of legal equality. Groups with long histories of supremacy and privilege actually are able to maintain that privilege and supremacy quite well. I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of Palestinian intellectuals are actually concerned that full legal equality won't actually change that much, right? But at least it seems to me is an important first step towards a deeper and more substantive equality, which I ultimately think will be more peaceful. I guess someone's cell phone disagreed.
Yeah, it's a musical evening. So my very last question actually will tie back to something you said earlier about moral obligation. In 1917, she was writing to a friend, and Rosa Luxemburg, the revolutionary socialist, wrote these famous or infamous sentences. What do you want with this theme of the special suffering of the Jews? I'm just as much concerned with the poor victims on the rubber plantations of Putumayo, the blacks in Africa with those corpses the Europeans play catch. They resound with me so strongly that I have no special place in my heart for the ghetto. I feel at home in the entire world, wherever there are clouds and birds and human tears. So, I guess you guess what is my question. You're You're a liberal, you're a universalist like me. Do you identify with Rosa Luxemburg's description of her commitment to the world and to the Jews? And if not, why not? Where does your universalism stop?
I mean, for me, that statement, I believe in the idea of the Jewish people as a kind of a family. It may be imaginary in a certain sense, but it's genuinely how what I believe. Any single place I happen to be in the world, if there is another Jewish person there, I feel a bond and a connection to them that is particular and greater than the bond and connection I feel towards the random other person that I meet. And so, since I believe that, this statement is like saying, I don't have any particular obligation to Ezra and Naomi, my own children, because I'm concerned about the suffering of children on the other side of the world. Yes, I am concerned about the suffering of those children, but I have my own family, and I have a special obligation to that family. So now that obligation doesn't give moral license to do anything. It has to be balanced against basic notions of decency and humanity. But I believe that, and I think maybe one might even say that, I don't know, that it's within the context of a particular kind of special obligation that one has to family, to community, to people, that one learns the sense of moral obligation that then you can extend to the rest of the world. I don't necessarily know that you can even truly have that sense of universal moral obligation if you don't have the chance to first practice it at a smaller scale. So in that sense, I'm not fully a universalist. And the irony, I would say, among American Jews, among American Jewish progressives, is that if I go to a college campus, and I do go to college campuses all the time, and I try to say to people, I was in Masafer Yatta. Here's what a Jewish state is on the precipice of doing to 2,800 Palestinians, expelling them from their homes. If they're true universalists, they may say to me, I'm sorry, but I don't really care, because there's so many other larger scale atrocities and terrible things happening all over the world. The most difficult argument for me with any progressive young American Jew to anything I say about Israel, Palestine, it's never, you're being too hard on Benjamin Netanyahu. The most difficult response is always, why should I care about this as opposed to climate change, right? That is a far more important issue for the fate of the world. This is a niche little parochial thing, right? And so in a funny way, I actually find that if you want to mobilize progressive American Jews, you actually have to tap into some notion that they have a special reason to care about this place. If they are, because there's a question of Jewish honor at stake here. There's a question about who we are as a people, whether our ethical tradition actually means anything at all, or whether it was just some nice ideas that people had when Jews had no power and collapses the minute Jews actually do wield power. If they take the Rosa Luxemburg position, I can't really get them to care about Palestinians much at all. So for me, that's why I'm not a universalist in the Rosa Luxemburg sense.
Thank you so much. I think we can all say thank you.
So I'm looking at the audience to see whether the audience has patience for one or two questions from the audience, or should we call it a night?
We should
Eva says call it a night. So, let's take, I think it would be fair to the audience. Is that okay, Peter?
Sure, fine.
Okay, so let's just collect 2-3 quick comments, okay? Not long statements, real questions. Is that okay?
Yeah. I was very impressed, and I really like what you said with a lot of things. I have a couple of queries, though. One of them is that recently the Supreme Court of the United States cancelled affirmative action. And personally, I feel that affirmative action is important for the way in which the Negro community, African-American community, was treated over a couple of hundred years. So why is there a problem of not having some affirmative action in relationship to Jews who suffered for a lot longer and incredibly harshly recently?
So let's call that the affirmative action question. Let's collect 2 more quick questions.
The Democratic Party and its relations to Israel, will there be a reevaluation, and do you think that they will actually take some real action against what's happening here, or stay away from it?
Thank you. Democratic Party question?
We were introduced by saying that you were going to look for nuances. And I noticed that you created a binary between liberal democracy and ethnic democracy, that you spoke about Datim and Chiloni. And I'm wondering whether you accept all those binaries, including Sephardi, Ashkenazi, or is there a growing overlap in this country that if the language can change, we might be able to find bridges not only among Jews, but between Jews and Arabs?
Okay, Peter, to you, and Eva, if you want to add.
On the third question, it's true, maybe I wasn't, because of the form, I couldn't nuance things as much as I might have liked. I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer. I think it really it takes people who live here, who are immersed in the political culture of this place, to find that language. I would be extremely interested in what, I'm sure that there are many at Van Leer who are doing exactly that, but I have to be the, I lack the capacity to generate that myself, but I'm a very eager recipient of it. On the question of, I'll go back in alternative order. In the question of the Democratic Party, public opinion is moving quite swiftly in the Democratic Party towards a more pro-Palestinian position. I mean, I don't like the way they ask that question. Do you sympathize more with the Palestinians or sympathize with Israel? I think it's a terrible way to ask the question. But it's clearly being driven by younger people. Now, and you can see it in the media as well. In the media, if you look at the New York Times editorial page or cable news networks like MSNBC, you see a real shift. What Edward Said famously said, that Palestinians lack permission to narrate, they still don't have nearly the same voice that Jews do in the public discourse about Israel, but they have a significantly more permission to narrate than they did 5 years ago. And part of that, I think, is because of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too phenomenon, which created a greater sensitivity to questions of representation in the media and created a new sense of embarrassment about the fact that Palestinians were always being talked about, but never being heard from. And bringing Palestinians on stage has a very significant impact. Also, I think the end of the war on terror, because that produced such an intense Islamophobia that it retarded the ability of Palestinians and Arab and Muslim Americans to enter into any foreign policy debates. And I think the fact that now there are lots of other problems with us, are now Cold War with China, but in some ways that eases, I think, and means that the demographic weight of these communities, many of which are post-1965 communities of immigrants, starts to be felt a little bit. And so I think that now what groups like AIPAC and the American Jewish organizations have done is they've tried to erect a firewall between the Democratic Party base and Democratic politicians. And they've done so because the American electoral system is so deeply corrupt and essentially deregulated that you can put in almost infinite amounts of money into congressional campaigns. So what AIPAC and other organizations did very successfully in the last midterm election is they intervened in Democratic primaries. And whenever there was a progressive who showed even any inkling of having any sympathy for Palestinians at all, they put in huge sums of money to defeat that person. And they were very successful in doing that. Without them, the squad, right, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, would have continued to grow. They basically retarded its growth because of those interventions. But they are still fighting against a cultural phenomena that I think over time will probably break through. It will break through
also among Jews.
Among Jews, right? Jews are part of that coalition, right? It will break through much faster if Israel-Palestine is an issue in the news in the United States. If it's not an issue in the news, then it's easier for politicians to ignore their constituents. But what we saw 2 years ago, when it broke through with the uprisings, the rebellions of 2 years ago, then people became conscious that their politicians in the Democratic Party were out of step with them, and the politicians came under a lot of pressure. So I think to some degree it depends on what happens on the ground. On the last question, affirmative action, which is a really good question, and I've thought about it a bit. I guess I would say a couple of things. First of all, the moral basis of affirmative action is that the beneficiaries of this historic oppression pay some price to equal the playing field, right? The Palestinians are not the beneficiaries of this historical anti-Semitism that plagued Jews in Europe and other places. They're not the equivalent of white Americans who might, lose a few points on the college admission scale to help black Americans. So in that way, the analogy is just incorrect. I might also suggest that in a certain sense, the affirmative action has already taken place, right? The affirmative action was the fact that because of the British, obviously it ended with the white paper, but for a very long period of time, a colonial power opened the door to Jews to come here, even though the native population really didn't want them coming in such large numbers with a Zionist project. And Jews were allowed to do that for a whole series of complicated reasons, but partly because there was some feeling that Europe's Christians had not done right by Jews, and that those people were allowed to come, were allowed to flourish, and will continue to be allowed to stay. It's just that the privilege the privilege will end in the sense that you will no longer have a kind of immigration system that allows any Jew in the world to come and become citizen on day one, and a Palestinian who was expelled in 1948 won't be able to return.
So please join me in thanking Peter Beinart and Eva Illouz. And a special thank you to this audience. You've been wonderful and patient and listening to ideas that not necessarily you agreed with everything and asking wonderful questions. Thank you and hope to see you in our next event.